And it was a stupid thing to do. The people who told me are 100% convinced it's true. I say this, but I also say we don't know. I haven't seen any evidence, but I'm repeating it. And they said that Mubarak did this, but the phone was bugged by military intelligence. And the generals, not Tantawi, but the other generals went to see Mubarak and said, we have got this evidence that you've been talking to a foreign power about creating clashes in which our army would be used, and either you go or now you will be charged with high treason, because this is treasonable. And that forced him finally to agree to depart. And that fall, as we all know, of Mubarak was extremely important. Whereas Ben Ali's fall triggered off a huge movement in Egypt because people felt, I mean, I think if there are any Arab friends here, they will know that the Tunisians are regarded in the Arab world as the softest, nicest, kindest, pleasure-seeking, pleasure-loving lotus eaters that you can find in the Arab world. And when they succeeded in toppling their despot, Arab pride in the heart of the Arab world was, if they can do it, why can't we? And it's very interesting. It took the toppling of Ben Ali for the movement in Egypt to really go up. I mean, there were small groups demonstrating regularly, but suddenly the movement began to go up and up and up. And just as a footnote here, the Tunisian dictator received a message from Sarkozy's defense minister, Marie Alliot, saying, don't go. We are ready to send French paratroopers. We are very experienced in this, the message said. So don't go, we will keep you in power. But it was already too late. The military had told him he had to get out because the situation was completely out of control and they couldn't vouch for the loyalty of their soldiers. So he hopped on a plane to Saudi Arabia, which is a good place for these guys to go because they have ready access to their money because all the banks are there. And the money they've been looting from their own countries, which is put in foreign banks. Most of these banks have branches in Saudi Arabia, so that's why they all want to go there, not because the social life there is great. Mubarak didn't want to go there, and he might well now end up in prison. His wife was arrested. But it's interesting that the events that triggered this off were dual. One, mass unemployment, both in Tunisia and in Egypt, exacerbated by the crisis of 2008. I mean, if you look at what's happening in parts of Europe, Ireland, Greece, Spain, Portugal, Britain, you can just imagine the impact on these countries which were part of a similar system and heavily dependent on European banks for credit. And when this credit began to seize up, unemployment rose. And in Tunisia, interestingly enough, a large bulk of the population is literate, it's educated, unlike Libya, to which I'll come in a moment. And in Egypt, too, people were educated. Not to the same degree, but they were. And so the massive increase in unemployment, the lack of social safety nets for the population, and at the same time, the elite in these countries, blinded by its own greed, carrying on as if nothing major was going on. So it's a crisis, so we carry on. I mean, it happens here too, obviously. But when it happens in countries where the disparities between the rich and the rest are huge, then the effect is electric. And it's the combination of demands for political freedom and economic shifts which basically topple these people. In Egypt, we know Tahrir Square, which, I don't need to stress, we all know about it. But what is less talked about is factory occupations, strikes in factories, outside Cairo, outside Alexandria, with towards the end of the movement, workers beginning to join the movement in huge numbers. So the demands were twofold. One, political freedom and democracy, and B, an end to this economic situation where corruption and rich elites can get away with it forever. Which is why, both in the case of Tunisia and in the case of Egypt, you have the transitional governments trying to show that they're doing something. Ben Ali's family, which has huge properties in Canada, the Canadian government has been asked now by the Tunisian government to seize these assets because they were built with money stolen from the state and return them, and some of them are being returned. And Mubarak's wife has now voluntarily, after being arrested, said that she is prepared to return the huge house she has in Cairo in her name and the $3 million in the bank accounts in Egypt, but which she can't deny because they've got the figures. But what about the monies abroad? But the fact that they're doing this is an indication that they know what the score is, and something has to be done. Not totally cosmetic, some real measures have to be taken. So in both Tunisia and Egypt, we are now in a important moment of a transition. The mood in these countries is one of hope and also one of people feeling very strong and confident. Despite not getting everything, they feel they could if they wanted. And the military knows they could again if they wanted. So it's a critical situation in both these countries. Elsewhere, what do we see? In Yemen, we have a complete stalemate. The military has split. The movement that was started off by university students in Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, and spread very, very rapidly. And for those of you who don't know, Yemen was once South Yemen and North Yemen. South Yemen, initially colonized by the British, threw up huge liberation movements in the 60s, three big national movements, one led by communists of various stripes and Marxists, one led by people supporting Nasser of Egypt, that nationalist current, and a third independent of both. So there was a very high level of political mobilization and political consciousness, and it ended with the left-wing groups who called themselves communists taking power. So the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen was run by the local communists for some time. And they, of course, did what they tend to do, unfortunately, which is fight each other, kill each other. There was a big shootout in the Politburo building. The people who lost that initially said that the guy who carried it out was on the payroll of the West, which may be true, I don't know. But in any case, it discredited all of them. And when this happened, there was huge pressure for a reunification of Yemen, which took place, carried out by the military. The first three presidents were rapidly assassinated. And then this guy, Saleh, who is still in power, took charge. And he says, even today, he says, when I became president, no one wanted to be president because everyone was scared of being killed. So I took over, and I've been there for 40 years, so why do you want to get rid of me? He doesn't seem to appreciate that the world has moved on a bit. Now, the problem here is that the US and the West has backed this guy on the grounds that there's a huge Al-Qaeda presence. Now, you know, huge Al-Qaeda presence is a contradiction in terms. Every single Western intelligence agency agree that they have at maximum between 2,000 and 3,000 members globally. I think that's an exaggeration myself. But that is what the intelligence figures are. And when I was in Yemen 2 years ago, I asked a former prime minister who agreed to be interviewed by me and who sort of slightly threw me by saying that he was a great fan of Thomas Friedman. But never mind, I bit my lip and smiled and said, that's interesting. But basically I wanted to ask him one question, because he is the key fixer. He's been Prime Minister of the Yemen twice or thrice, Foreign Minister. And he is the key person who is the go-between between the United States and Saleh. He takes orders, he delivers them. So I said to him, I said, you know, we're alone now talking and I haven't got a tape recorder or anything, but I'm making notes. Just tell me how many Al-Qaeda people are there in the Yemen? Because the US government is saying they've got a huge military base. And at first he didn't reply, then he burst out laughing. He said, it's just a joke. So I said, well, okay, how many? So he said, well, I said 200 or 300. He said 300 is an exaggeration. I said 200, he said maybe. And when I went to South Yemen, this was in the north, when I went to the south of Yemen and asked local people in areas where the Al-Qaeda had a big base, supposedly, I said, you know what, is there an Al-Qaeda base there? They said, look, a few people, dozens come across the Saudi border, do their business and go back into Saudi Arabia. I said, right. So I said, well, what about Al-Qaeda? And one guy came up to me and actually said, do you want to know where Al-Qaeda is? I said, well, yeah, where? He said, they're in an office next to the president's office in our capital. And by this he meant that the government creates this menace to say to the West, look, we are under threat, you better help us, you better back us, you better keep us funded, or else Al-Qaeda will take over Yemen. And this is, of course, a total fantasy. Total fantasy. So the West can't make up its mind whether to keep this joker in power or not. One week they say, get out. The other week they say, no, 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 hang on in there. We're not sure about these people who are fighting you. And the people who are fighting him are the bulk of the population. He is hated in the south of Yemen, where they say if he stays, we will separate again. So the struggle in the Yemen goes on, showing, you know, it's very difficult to see who's going to triumph. Then you have Libya. Here you had a struggle that began, a struggle in which Gaddafi's army and air force were beginning to peel away, and a struggle in which, of course, Gaddafi is a sort of totally, slightly crazy, totally maverick figure. But he wasn't going to give up power easily, but that is well known. But, you know, Mubarak wasn't either. Instead of allowing the struggle to develop organically and see how far it would go, the French in particular, and the British, because this was not an American initiative, they were dragged into it screaming. I mean, Gates actually made a public statement, more or less to the effect, we need our heads examined if we're going to be dragged into this, but the politicians decided to do it. Why? Because they thought they could win an easy victory, and then show that we are on the side of these rebellions, and use that initiative to intervene in other parts of the Arab world, but that's backfired sensationally. Because the bombing by NATO of this country changes both the relation